What's up, y'all? Today we are unleashing our inner cheapskates to help dispel the notion that growing your own food at home is somehow more expensive than buying it at the store. Sounds like a crazy notion, but it's something that you're going to hear all the time in gardening circles. So without further ado, let's jump right into 13 ways to make food gardening at home super cheap. Tip number 1, grow as much as you can from seed. Trust me, if you stick with gardening for long enough, you too are going to be addicted to buying these little packets of joy. To make this tip a little bit more concrete, let's use our nightshade garden for a good example. So this year we grew about 140 tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, tomatillos, etc. And we planted maybe 60 to 70 of those between our front garden and sort of our backyard toddler garden. We gave away probably another 40 or 50 to friends and family, and then some just ended up in the compost because they weren't very strong. If we had bought that same number of plants from the local big box store, we'd be looking at least $500. Or if we wanted to buy all the cool heirloom plants that we got, we'd be looking at least double that. Totally infeasible. Instead, we spent $15, $20 perhaps on seeds. To make it even cheaper, you can buy your seeds from places like dollarseed.com, which of course costs $1 per packet, or migardener.com, who I love, and they sell their packets for $2 a packet. Both are really reasonable. Or you can even go with somewhere like freeheirloomseeds.com, and they will literally send you like 4 packets of heirloom seeds, depending on the time of the year, for free. Even if you consider all of the investments we made into our seed starting rack, you know, with the grow lights and the heat mats and the fancy timers and all that good stuff, we are still coming out way ahead, because we're going to be planting and growing thousands of seedlings through the year. So that would be thousands of dollars in seed starts rather than a couple $100s on that grow rack and tens of dollars on seeds. Plus, all that fancy seed starting equipment is completely unnecessary, especially when you're just getting started. Grab a 72 cell seed starting tray and one of these drainless propagation trays, and you're good to go. Most of our seed starting goes towards annuals, even though we do a couple perennials like this cool little dwarf tamarillo that I'm excited about. But that doesn't mean that we can't save money when we need new perennials too. Take for instance this heritage red raspberry. I'm pretty excited about it. It's growing really well, better than I expected it to be honest. It's already starting to flower, and I'm pretty sure already that I'm gonna want another one. Luckily, it is gonna be really easy to clone or propagate this plant by just taking a cutting later in the year. Same with this fellow caneberry, a black satin blackberry. We don't even have it in a container yet, but I do know that if I wanna get a cutting, put another one maybe in the ground, I'm gonna be able to do that. Same deal with this yostaberry up here. Cool plant, I might want another one. Once we let it get established, I'll make that choice. Pretty easy to propagate. Even everyone's favorite, the blueberry, pretty easy to propagate using cuttings later in the year when it's gone dormant. Seriously, if you haven't tried propagating or cloning some of your perennial plants, I definitely recommend giving it a chance. It takes a little while, it's not gonna work every time, but it's probably easier than you're imagining it is. If you can't find a plant to propagate from, don't despair, stay patient, wait for winter. Bare root plants that you can find during winter are almost always a cheaper buy than something larger and more established with an established root system. In our area, Costco tends to have screaming good deals on bare root trees in the winter. Take for instance, this Santa Rosa plum tree. While we're not letting it fruit yet, just so that it can kind of establish itself and set roots, we did let it bloom, and it blooms really beautifully. And in that way, it's already providing a ton of value for our yard by helping to pollinate our older and more established aprium and pluod and other plum trees. Great buy at a very low price. All right, next tip, check out the gardening aisle of your local dollar store, or Dollar General, or Daiso, or whatever your local option is, right? I've been totally shocked at how useful their gardening equipment is. For instance, check out this $1 container that we put our little baby lavender into that is destined to become a Mother's Day gift. Or check out these trowels. $1, they work great. We also picked up a pack of these little plastic cups for potting up our tomatoes earlier in the year. They even sell, at least at our local store, these larger containers. Yeah, okay, the quality, not the best, a little bit flimsy, but I think that's fine. And hear me out, right? If the alternative to buying something cheap like these containers is not buying anything at all and not growing anything at all, then buy cheap and grow food. Like I'm not a big fan of the buy once, cry once mantra when applied to food gardening, because even if you buy something cheap and it only lasts a single season, well, that's a season's worth of food that you grew that you wouldn't have otherwise. That's why I follow what is sometimes referred to as the Harbor Freight rule. Buy something cheap, and then down the line, if we decide we need it, we can go with something a little bit more expensive, robust, nicer, whatever. Like, look, I have my collection of gardening tools, and I'm pretty sure that collection is only gonna grow. But honest truth, 9 times out of 10, in the garden, when I have something I just need to get done quickly, I am using this $13 multi-tool I got off of Amazon. It's got a little pair of pliers on it. It's got a little knife. It's got a little saw. It's got a little screwdriver. It can do most of what I need. And sure, I don't really expect it to last that long, but it gets a ton of use. If and when it fails, yeah, I'll probably upgrade and get something a little bit nicer, because now I know that this is really handy to have on my person. And I wouldn't have if I hadn't bought the cheap option. And I'm getting a ton of use out of it in the meantime. Tip number 6, another great way to save money on your garden is to skip the raised beds, at least in year 1, and plant directly in the ground. So a good example of this is I was listening to a podcast recently, and the host was kind of lamenting the fact that he had been convinced by a fellow gardener to spend a bunch of money building raised beds, filling those raised beds, and planting squash in them, on the idea that this was going to help him save some money on his groceries. Yet those squash, in a best case scenario, were going to save him $20, $30 that year, maybe a little bit more, and the raised beds had cost hundreds of dollars to build and fill up. The whole thing kind of bummed me out, to be honest, because while raised beds can be really great in a lot of situations, they're also really trendy right now, and they're really, really expensive. Even if you build them there yourself, they can still be pretty pricey, right? Whereas our entire nightshade garden, which we planted directly into the ground, cost maybe $30 in soil amendment. And actually, this ground here, the ground that we planted them into, is pure clay soil. And I know for a fact that that ground left alone will not support tomatoes, because I tried last year and it failed miserably. So all I had to do was mix in a ton of steer manure and compost, and now they're growing like bonkers for maybe 50 cents per planting hole. That's a really good deal when you think that it would cost at least $1,000, maybe closer to $1,500 to build and fill enough raised beds to cover this whole garden space. $30 in amendments or $1,500 for raised beds. Don't get me wrong, I like raised beds. I actually think they're a little bit nicer to garden in. So if I decide, hey, this garden space is really going to work out for us and this is doing great, in the future, once I've really established these plants and I've gotten a good hold on the space, I can make that investment. Of course, growing in the ground is not always going to be a great option. Maybe you don't have the space for it. Maybe your soil is truly messed up. In that case, go out and buy yourself some non-woven fabric grow bags like these. These are 10-gallon options. They cost me about $1.50 on sale, but they go on sale all the time. And they are more than large enough to support a tomato or multiple flowers, right? We've got nasturtium, sunflowers, a cosmo in this one. You can even fit a tomato and a companion plant in one of them if you're feeling a little bit ambitious. Last night, I went on Amazon and I bought a 100-gallon version for $11. Something that large is going to be more than adequate for what I have in mind, either a Mediterranean herb garden or a leafy green garden with some nice flowers mixed in. And it's not like these things suck, right? Like, you're not giving up anything. They're really, really good containers. They have great aeration, they have great drainage, and root growth actually tends to be a little bit better in these than most other types of containers. Honestly, from a purely functional perspective, I'm not saying they necessarily look the nicest. These are probably my favorite go-to container type. They work really, really well. And when it comes to filling up all those grow bags, make your own DIY potting mix. I use cheap ingredients like this steer manure blend or bagged organic compost. And when there's a sale on in-ground garden soil like this stuff, it was $2 a cubic foot. I load up because it's basically just wood fines and sphagnum peat moss, which is a really helpful ingredient for a DIY potting mix. I've got a video on how I do this, but if you don't like that one, go check out one of the hundreds of others. There's seriously a good DIY potting mix for every type of soil and every plant out there. It's a really good way to save a ton of money. Okay, all of that soil is definitely going to need some compost at some point, so set up your own Berkeley Hot Compost pile. It's really easy. All you need is a very large container, 3 feet by 3 feet or even a little bit larger. I used chicken wire that I found on sale for a couple bucks a roll to make this basically a free DIY project. Berkeley Hot Composting is really cool, especially compared to traditional slow cold composting, because it creates the output very, very fast. I will leave a link in the description with full instructions. Composting, obviously great, you should definitely do, but I actually like worm composting or vermicomposting even better. Let me show you what I mean. These little guys make amazing soil amendment for the cost of some food scraps and wood chips added to their bin once a week. Me and a buddy split our order from Uncle Jim's worm farm to make even the initial investment pretty cheap. Oh, speaking of wood chips, all these wood chips that I use in literally all of my videos, well, we got them for free using ChipDrop. ChipDrop is a free service, we're totally unaffiliated, that basically connects people who need a lot of wood chip mulch with arborists who need to get rid of theirs. Now, it's a good idea to do a lot of due diligence in your research before you sign up for ChipDrop, because you don't have a lot of control over the timing or the amount of wood chip, or sometimes even the location of where they drop them off. But if you are really flexible, it can be a great option for someone who wants to save money and has a lot of flexibility with their wood chip mulch. This DIY tomato trellis was put together primarily using $2 furring strips from the local big box store. Now, these are 8-foot options, and I only really need about 6.5 feet for my tomato trellis. So even better, I'm able to cut off the top 18 inches or so, and then I split these in two, leaving me with one 6.5-inch stake for my tomato trellis, and then an additional two 18-inch stakes that I can use for more compact plants like eggplants or peppers. By the way, I'd really love to talk about this tomato trellis a little bit more, but it's kind of experimental, so I want to wait until the end of the season to see how it does before I make a video about it. Suffice to say, it's super, super cheap. This yarn was bought from the dollar store. Tip number 13, last one, for all those corner cases where you just need to pay the money, be done, get the darn thing, check out a deal tracker site like Slick Deals. I've been really surprised with how much good gardening stuff they actually have on there. Take, for instance, this wood barrel planter we picked up. We needed a large planter for some passion flowers that were germinating in the front yard, but this one is going to go somewhere a little bit more front and center and kind of facing the street. So we wanted something maybe a little bit more aesthetically interesting than our go-to black fabric grow bags. So we waited for a deal to come up and picked these up for, I think, about $15 for a 20-inch wood barrel pot. And $15 still kills me for what is essentially a pot to put a plant in, but ultimately it's still a lot cheaper than buying at retail. If you have any tips that I didn't cover, I would actually really love to see them in the comments. And otherwise, until next time, happy gardening, y'all.